When my husband said those words, I froze. Not because I hadn't heard them clearly, but because I did. Every syllable, every breath between the words, landed like a stone in my chest. He was in the next room, speaking on the phone. His tone was casual, almost bored, the way you speak about something that doesn't matter to you. But I mattered, or at least I thought I did. I was folding his shirts in the bedroom when I heard him say it. That fat woman disgusts me. The silence after those words stretched long. It filled the small apartment like heavy air. My hands trembled over the fabric, but I kept folding, slowly, carefully, like if I just focused hard enough on the creases, I could hold myself together. When he came out, I smiled. A small, practiced smile that I had learned long ago, the one that says I didn't hear anything, everything is fine. He didn't notice. He just asked if dinner was ready. That night, I served him like always. Warm chapati, lentils, rice. I watched him eat in silence, pretending to look at my phone. Inside, something was cracking quietly. No sound, no drama, just a slow splitting of something I had carried for years. After dinner, he went to bed early. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the half-finished cup of tea. The ceiling fan made a soft whirring noise, like a lullaby for the broken. I thought about all the years, the marriage, the sacrifices, the times I laughed even when I wanted to cry. And I thought, how did we get here? I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always quiet. Before marriage, I was full of life. I used to laugh loudly, talk endlessly with my friends, and believe love was about kindness. I remember the day he proposed, not on one knee, not with flowers, but with quiet words that felt safe. He said, "You're calm. You make me feel at peace." I believed him. I thought that was love. After marriage, life was simple. We lived in a modest home, white walls, a small garden where I planted marigolds, and evenings filled with routine. He worked long hours. I cooked, cleaned, and waited for him to come home. There were no grand arguments, no shouting matches, just slow distances growing between us like invisible walls. He wasn't cruel, not at first, just indifferent. He forgot anniversaries, skipped small compliments, and stopped noticing new dresses. But I told myself, he's tired, he's busy, this is normal. I didn't see the loneliness creeping in. I only felt it at night when he turned away to sleep, and I stared at the ceiling, tracing stories in the darkness. Then, years passed. The house grew quieter, my reflection softer. I gained weight after my son's birth. Slowly my body changed. And though I tried to accept it, the tired eyes, the stretch marks, the rounder cheeks, I noticed how he looked at me less. I began cooking more of his favorite dishes, wearing clothes I thought he liked. I even stopped wearing colors he said didn't suit me. It didn't matter. His eyes were elsewhere. And then that day came. That sentence. That fat woman disgusts me. Not shouted. Not argued, just spoken like a fact. I wondered if he was talking to someone. A friend, a colleague, maybe. Someone else. But in the end, it didn't matter. The words were mine now. They belonged to the ache sitting quietly inside my chest. That night, as he slept, I walked to the balcony. The moonlight touched the marigolds, still blooming after all these years. They didn't seem to mind that no one noticed them anymore. I stood there for a long time, listening to the crickets, the soft hum of the night, and my own breathing. I whispered to myself, maybe love doesn't leave in storms. Maybe it just fades quietly when no one waters it anymore. The next morning, I woke early. I made breakfast, ironed his clothes, packed his lunch. Everything like always, only this time I wasn't pretending for him. I was pretending for me, because pretending was easier than breaking. When he left for work, I didn't look at him. When he said bye, I just nodded. That day, I went to my room, took out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of us, younger, smiling, standing close. I touched his face in one of the pictures. He had his arm around me, and I remembered how safe that used to feel. I smiled again, a small, sad smile. And then, for the first time in years, I decided to go out. I went to the nearby market, walked through the narrow lanes filled with the smell of spices and fried snacks. I bought a simple blue dupatta, my favorite color, one I had stopped wearing because he once said it made me look dull. When I came home, I made tea for myself and sat on the floor near the window. The sun was warm on my face. For a brief moment, I felt like myself again, the girl who used to laugh too loudly, who loved blue, who didn't measure her worth by someone else's approval. But deep down, I knew something had changed forever. He came home late that evening, tired, silent. We ate without talking much. Before bed, he said, "You're quiet today." I just smiled and said, "I'm tired." But I wasn't tired. I was awakening. That night I prayed. Not for him, not for love to return, but for peace. Peace to accept what is. Peace to forgive. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to stop carrying it. And when I finished praying, a strange calm filled the room. I looked at him sleeping beside me, the same man who once made my heart race, and now barely noticed my existence, and I whispered softly, "I forgive you." He didn't hear it, but I did, and that was enough. The next few days passed like ripples on still water, no sudden storms, just soft, quiet movements, the kind you almost don't notice until they've changed everything. He went to work, came home, scrolled through his phone, and slept. And I moved through the house like a shadow, silent, but always there. Sometimes I wondered if he even noticed the way my steps had grown softer, the way my laughter had vanished. But I knew he didn't, because to notice silence, you must first remember the sound that came before it. Our son Ayan was 12 then, a bright, curious boy with too many questions and a heart that still believed everything good in the world came from love. He didn't see the spaces between us, not yet, but I knew one day he would. Children always do. One evening, as I was folding laundry, he came to me and said, "Mama, why doesn't Baba smile anymore?" I looked at him, his eyes searching mine for an answer that wouldn't hurt. I forced a smile and said, "He's just tired from work, Beta. That's all." He nodded, but his little face stayed thoughtful. Then he said something that stayed with me for a long time. "Mama, when I grow up, I'll make sure my wife always smiles." Something inside me broke and healed at the same time. I hugged him tightly, burying my face in his hair so he wouldn't see the tears in my eyes. That night, when my husband came home, I tried again, the way I always did. I asked about his day. He gave short answers. I told him Ayan got good marks in his test. He just nodded. Then, halfway through dinner, his phone buzzed. He picked it up instantly, his face softening in a way it hadn't in months. He walked to the balcony, smiling faintly, speaking in that tone people use when they want to be seen as gentle. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. When he came back, I looked at him and said quietly, "You're happy talking to her?" He froze, his eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" I said nothing, only lowered my gaze. He sighed, annoyed. "Don't start drama. You always imagine things." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." He went to bed angry, and I stayed in the kitchen again, with my cup of tea gone cold. The rain started outside, tapping gently on the window. The smell of wet earth filled the air, nostalgic, heavy, and pure. I whispered to myself, if love leaves quietly, maybe it's not the leaving that hurts. Maybe it's realizing you waited too long to notice. Over the next few weeks, the silence grew heavier. He started staying out late. Sometimes he didn't answer my calls. When he did, his voice was distant, polite, almost like talking to a stranger. I tried to reach him in small ways. A note in his lunchbox. A text that said, "Drive safe," cooking his favorite biryani on Sundays. But nothing changed. One evening, as I was setting the table, he came in, looking frustrated. "Why is this house always a mess?" He snapped. I looked around. Everything was in its place. The floor was clean, the dishes washed, the table neatly set. I said softly, "What's messy?" He waved his hand. "You don't understand. You just sit here all day." That stung. Not because of the words, but because of the years behind them. I wanted to shout that I had given everything, my time, my youth, my body, my peace. But instead I just said, "I'm sorry." He didn't respond. He just went to his room and shut the door. That night, as I lay beside him, I could hear his steady breathing. The same rhythm that once comforted me now felt like a wall between us. I turned away and whispered to the dark, "When did love turn into endurance?" Days blurred into one another. The marigolds outside had started to dry. I forgot to water them for weeks. Even the sun seemed duller somehow. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning the living room, I found a scarf, not mine. A delicate, pale pink scarf with perfume that wasn't mine either. My heart stopped. I sat there, holding it, the fabric soft against my hands but heavy with meaning. It wasn't proof. It didn't need to be. Sometimes silence and absence are proof enough. When he came home, I didn't mention it. I simply placed the scarf neatly folded on his side of the bed. He noticed it, hesitated, and said coldly, "Don't touch my things." Then he stuffed it into a drawer and walked out. That was the moment something inside me died, quietly, peacefully, like a candle burning out. "That was a long time ago," he smiled sadly. "Maybe you should again." I didn't respond, just closed the box and kept it aside. It wasn't the gesture that mattered anymore. It was what came after. Over the next few days, he tried little things. Making tea in the morning, asking if I needed anything, helping Ayan with homework. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And strangely, I didn't feel bitter. I didn't want to punish him. I just wanted peace. Every night, I still prayed. But now my prayers were different. I didn't ask for love to return. I asked for strength, to be kind, to stay calm, to forgive without forgetting who I was. And with time, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about saying, "It's okay." It was about saying, "It happened, but it no longer controls me." One afternoon, weeks later, he found me sitting in the garden. The marigolds had started to bloom again, small, bright, unapologetically alive. He stood beside me quietly and said, "They grew back." I smiled faintly. "Yes, they always do." He looked at me and said, "Do you think we can grow back too?" I paused, then said gently, "Maybe, but only if we water what we forgot. Kindness, patience, honesty." He nodded, a small tear rolling down his cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I just looked at him and said softly, "It starts with being human again." And for the first time in a long time, we sat together, not husband and wife, not strangers, just two people who had hurt each other and were trying to heal. The sunset bathed the garden in warm light. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings. And inside me, something loosened. The heaviness that had followed me for years finally began to fade. The days that followed felt different. Not lighter, not brighter, but gentler. The tension that once filled the house began to thin out, like fog lifting after a long night. It wasn't that everything was fixed. Far from it. But there was space again. Space to breathe, to speak, to exist without fear of being invisible. I started noticing the small things again, the smell of cardamom and morning tea, the warmth of sunlight creeping through the curtains, the laughter of Ayan echoing through the rooms. For a long time, I had lived like a ghost in my own home, moving quietly, leaving no trace. Now, I wanted to live fully, even if it was imperfect. My husband, I still called him that, though sometimes the word felt strange, had changed in small, cautious ways. He began coming home earlier, helping Ayan with schoolwork, asking about my day. At first, it felt forced, like an apology trying to take shape. But after a while, it became natural. One morning, as I was making breakfast, he walked into the kitchen. The scent of parathas filled the air, and I was humming an old song my mother used to sing. He leaned against the doorframe, just watching me for a moment. Then he said softly, "I forgot you used to sing." I turned surprised. "You used to listen." He smiled faintly, a tired, genuine smile. Maybe I stopped listening too soon. I didn't reply. But for the first time, his words didn't sting. They just existed, like small pieces of truth finally finding their place. Later that day, when Ayan went to school, we sat together in the living room, the same space that had once held so many silences. He cleared his throat and said quietly, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about kindness. I looked up, waiting. He continued, I realized I didn't stop loving you because of who you became. I stopped loving you because I forgot how to love at all. Everything became routine. My work, our life, even you. And I let that become normal. I listened silently. He added, his voice trembling a little. I thought strength meant not showing emotion. But you were stronger because you carried it all and still stayed gentle. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. His words felt foreign but sincere. I just nodded slowly. We both forgot things, I guess. He looked at me, a little hopeful. Can we remember again? I smiled softly. Maybe, but this time, not for the sake of what we were, for the sake of who we can be. He nodded, and there was a quiet understanding between us, the kind that doesn't need promises or apologies anymore. That evening, I went to the balcony to water the new marigolds. They had grown strong, reaching toward the sunlight. The orange and yellow petals glowed against the fading sky. He joined me, standing beside me without speaking. After a long silence, he said, I bought some new seeds. Thought we could plant them together. I looked at him, surprised, then took the small packet from his hand. Tulsi, I read. You remembered I like the smell. He smiled softly. I remember now. We planted them together in the cool evening light. Our hands brushed lightly in the soil, a quiet touch, not of romance, but of peace. For once, there was no awkwardness, just stillness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered, almost to myself, maybe this is how love returns, not loudly but softly, in small acts of remembering. He didn't reply, but I saw him close his eyes, as if holding on to that moment. In the weeks that followed, our rhythm changed again. We still had our silences, but they no longer felt empty. They were pauses filled with effort, with learning. He started joining me in the kitchen sometimes, chopping vegetables awkwardly. Ayan would laugh and tease, Baba, you're cutting them all wrong. And we'd all laugh, the kind of laughter that feels rusty at first, but slowly becomes natural again. There were nights when we still didn't talk much. Nights when he would look at me as if trying to say something but failing. But I learned not to fill those silences anymore. I just let them be. Because healing, I realized, isn't about forcing things to go back to how they were. It's about learning to live with what's left and finding beauty in it. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the shelves, I found that old pink scarf again. For a second, my heart paused, but then I smiled. It no longer hurt. I folded it neatly, placed it in a box, and set it aside. When he came home that evening, I told him I found the scarf. He froze, unsure what to say. I looked at him calmly and said, I kept it. Not because I want to remember what it meant, but because I've learned that forgetting isn't the same as forgiving. He looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in years. Thank you, he whispered. I nodded. Don't thank me. Just don't waste what's been rebuilt. Over time, our conversations grew easier. Sometimes we'd talk about Ayan's future, sometimes about simple things, the weather, food, old memories. He'd occasionally say, Remember when we went to the beach that one time? And I'd smile. Yes, when you dropped your phone in the water. We'd both laugh. It wasn't the same love we once had. It was quieter, older, a companionship that came from surviving pain together. And I found myself no longer longing for the old days. Because now, I had found peace, not because he changed completely, but because I had. One morning, while having tea, he said, You know, I've been thinking of taking a few days off. Maybe we could go somewhere, just you, me, and Ayan. I looked at him, surprised but pleased. Where would we go? He shrugged, smiling shyly. Anywhere you want. Maybe to the hills. You always liked the mountains. I felt warmth spread through me. Not excitement, just quiet gratitude. We'll see, I said softly. As he left for work that day, he paused at the door and said, Thank you for not giving up on me. I smiled faintly. I did give up once. Maybe that's what saved us. He looked confused for a second, then smiled too. the kind of smile that admits truth without needing to explain it. Later that evening, I stood by the balcony again. The marigolds and tulsi plants swayed gently in the wind. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the scent of earth, the touch of cool air, the sound of distant laughter. In that moment, I thought of all the versions of myself I had been. The young girl full of hope, the tired wife full of silence, the woman who broke quietly, and now, the one learning to bloom again, I whispered softly. Maybe every heartbreak is just a seed for something stronger. The world outside felt calm, forgiving. The next morning, I woke up early, before everyone else. The house was silent, golden light spilling through the curtains. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself tea, and sat at the table, the same table where years of pain and healing had unfolded. I looked at the empty chair across from me, once a symbol of absence, now just a chair. And I realized I no longer needed anyone to fill it for me to feel complete. I smiled to myself, quietly. When he came in, half awake, he said, "You're up early." I nodded. The morning felt too beautiful to miss. He poured himself tea and sat across from me. For a few moments, we just sat there, sipping in silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was peace. It has been many months since that morning. Life, in its quiet rhythm, has continued, not perfectly, not magically, but truthfully. There are still arguments sometimes, still moments when I feel the old ache return. But now, I meet it with gentleness instead of bitterness. I have learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what was done to you. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of it. When I held on to my pain, it kept me small. When I let it go, I finally saw how wide the sky could be. There was a time when I believed love was something you had to fight for, to prove your worth, to keep it alive. But now I know love cannot survive where peace is absent. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be kind. Sometimes when I watch Ayan playing, I think about what kind of love I want him to grow up believing in. After giving all its light. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just sat by the window, watching the streetlights blur in the rain. The house was silent except for Ayan's gentle breathing in the next room. I whispered, maybe I was never meant to be loved loudly. Maybe I was meant to be the quiet in someone else's chaos. The next morning, I woke early again. But something was different. I didn't feel the same pain. I felt stillness. I dressed simply, made breakfast, and when he sat down, I served him like always. He looked up at me once and said, "You've been acting strange lately." I smiled softly. Maybe I'm just learning to be quiet in a different way. He frowned but didn't ask more. After he left, I cleaned the house, then went to visit my neighbor, Mrs. Sharma, an older widow who always had kind eyes and warm tea. She looked at me and said, "You look tired, Beta." I nodded, and for the first time, I told someone a little of the truth. I didn't mention the cruel words or the scarf. I just said, sometimes love changes and you have to change with it. She held my hand gently and said, "Yes, but don't change so much that you disappear." That line stayed with me. Don't disappear. When I went home that evening, I looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. The tired lines, the weary eyes, the quiet sadness. But behind it all, there was still a spark. A small, stubborn spark of life. And I realized I hadn't disappeared yet. Visual cue. Fade in of soft rain outside the window. A reflection of her faint smile in the glass. Background piano deepened slightly. I started doing small things again. For me this time, not for him. I began taking evening walks. Bought a few plants. Started reading old books. Ayan would sometimes join me, holding my hand as we walked to the park. He'd chatter about school, friends, his dreams, and in those moments I felt alive again. His laughter filled the empty spaces his father's silence had left behind. Then one evening, while Ayan was doing homework, I was sitting with my tea when my husband came home earlier than usual. His face looked tired, not angry, just empty. He sat down across from me and said, You don't talk much anymore. I looked up. You never listened when I did. He flinched, not visibly, but I saw it. The truth has a way of landing softly, but cutting deep. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed and said, I don't know what's happening to us. I wanted to tell him everything. About the words he'd said, the scarf, the nights of silence. But instead, I just said quietly, we forgot how to be kind. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. He just nodded slowly and left the room. And I realized, maybe that's what distance truly is. Not arguments or betrayal, just the quiet absence of kindness. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing small changes in him too. He would try to talk more at dinner. He'd bring something from the market. Fruit, sweets for Ayan. It wasn't much, but it was something. I didn't trust it yet. But I also didn't close my heart completely. One night, as we sat together, a rare quiet togetherness, he said, You've changed. I smiled faintly. Maybe I've just stopped waiting for you to notice. He looked at me, almost guilty, but didn't speak again. That night, as I turned off the light, I thought, maybe forgiveness doesn't start with someone saying sorry. Maybe it starts when you stop needing them to. Scene transition, morning light filters through the curtains. The sound of Ayan's laughter fades into background piano. Life moved on like that. Not perfect. Not healed, but quietly shifting. I still remembered the words that started it all. But they no longer burned. They just existed like old scars, reminders, not wounds. And in their place, something new began to grow. A quiet strength. It was late autumn when everything shifted. The air had grown cooler, the evenings shorter, and there was a stillness in the house that felt both comforting and strange. Ayan had started going to tuition classes after school, and I had more time alone. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to see things as they were, not as I wanted them to be. That's when I found the message. He had left his phone on the table before going to shower. Normally, I never touched it. I believed that trust meant giving space. But that day, the screen lit up. A name, a heart emoji, and words that stopped me cold. I miss you already. It wasn't anger that filled me. It wasn't jealousy either. It was silence, the kind that spreads slowly, like fog, until it covers everything. I didn't open the chat. I didn't need to. The truth was already loud enough. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling years of quiet pain rise to the surface. All the nights I waited, all the mornings I smiled, all the times I convinced myself he was just tired, just distant, just human. He came out of the bathroom, drying his hair, humming a tune. When he saw me sitting there, holding his phone, the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand gently. Don't, I said softly. He stopped. For the first time, I looked at him. Really looked. The man I had built my life around. The man whose words once made me feel like I belonged. But now, all I could see was a stranger wearing his face. I know, I said quietly. You don't have to explain. He looked down, guilt flickering across his expression. It's not what you think. I smiled faintly. Then what is it? He didn't answer. His silence was enough. I placed the phone on the table and stood up. My voice was steady. I heard you that day, you know, when you called me disgusting. His eyes widened slightly, shame and shock mixing in his face. You heard that? I nodded. Yes, every word. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then he said softly, I didn't mean it. I was angry. Angry? I whispered. At what? My body, my age, or the fact that I stayed, even when you stopped loving me? He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You don't understand. I shook my head. No, I think I finally do. He looked at me helplessly, and for the first time, I saw not a cruel man, but a weak one, someone afraid to face what he had broken. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just said, you made me believe that being quiet was love, that endurance was devotion, but all it did was teach you that you could hurt me and I would stay." He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I walked past him to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the reflection in the window. The evening light had turned golden, wrapping everything in a sad kind of beauty. He followed me, standing in the doorway. "So what now?" he asked quietly. I looked at him and said, "Now I learn to live again, even if it's without you." He flinched slightly. "You want to leave?" I took a slow breath. "No, I want peace. Whether you're part of it or not, that's up to you." Then I turned and walked away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window again, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, people were laughing, eating, living, and here I was, rediscovering what it meant to breathe without pain. The next morning, he didn't speak much. The air between us was heavy, but different. He looked at me a few times, as if trying to read something on my face, but I had nothing left to hide. When he left for work, I didn't feel the ache I used to. Just a calm emptiness, like after a long storm. I cleaned the house slowly, humming softly to myself. The marigolds outside had wilted completely now. I decided to plant new ones. As I dug the soil, Ayan came running out. "Mama, what are you doing?" "Planting again," I said. He smiled, his eyes bright. "They'll grow back, right?" "Yes," I said, gently pressing the soil. "They always do." He grinned and helped me, his little hands dirty but full of joy. And for a moment, the heaviness in my heart lifted. That afternoon, as I was making lunch, the doorbell rang. It was my husband. Home early, he looked tired, older somehow. He stood there for a long time, not knowing what to say. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain, almost too late. I turned off the stove and faced him. "For what?" He looked down. "For everything. For the words, for the silence, for the way I made you feel." I studied his face, searching for truth. There was something different in his eyes, not the guilt of being caught, but the remorse of realizing the damage done. "I don't hate you," I said softly, "but I don't know how to trust you again." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I know, I lost myself somewhere. I don't expect forgiveness." I looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me." He swallowed hard, as if the words hit something deep inside him. Then I added, "But that doesn't mean I'll forget." He nodded again, and for the first time in years we stood in silence, not the cold, empty kind, but something gentler, a silence that carried understanding instead of anger. That evening, after he left to pick up Ayan, I sat down with my diary, the one I used to write in before life got too busy. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still mine. I wrote, slowly, carefully. Sometimes love doesn't end with shouting or doors slamming. It ends quietly, in forgotten words, in avoided eyes, in the way one person stops trying. But healing begins the same way too. Quietly, patiently, one breath at a time. When they returned, he brought sweets for Ayan, and a small box for me. Inside was a hairpin, simple and elegant. He said softly, "You used to wear these." I looked at it for a moment. Not the kind that sacrifices itself to please others, but the kind that builds a home where everyone feels safe, seen, heard, and loved. I used to think being a good wife meant enduring everything silently. Now I understand that being a good human means learning to speak your truth, gently, but firmly, and still choose compassion at the end. One evening, I sat by the window as rain began to fall. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and I felt something deep inside me stir. Memories came, of tears, of long nights, of quiet prayers whispered into pillows. But this time, they didn't hurt. They were just pieces of a story that had shaped me. I thought about all the women who might be sitting somewhere right now, trying to hold their hearts together in silence. I wanted to tell them, you are not weak for staying kind. You are strong for surviving pain without letting it turn you bitter. A few days ago, my husband came home with a small box. When I opened it, there was a pair of silver bangles inside. Simple, delicate, nothing extravagant, he said quietly. They reminded me of you. Not loud, but they shine anyway. I smiled, not because of the gift, but because I finally saw him seeing me. Not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone worth understanding. I wore those bangles not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as a quiet reminder that love can return, not the same as before, but gentler, wiser. And sometimes, that's enough. That night, as I lay in bed, I whispered a small prayer, not for things to stay perfect, but for strength to keep choosing peace even when life falters. Because life will always falter. People will fail you. Love will bruise you. But if you learn to soften instead of harden, you'll always find your way back to light. I've learned that silence can heal, that time can teach, and that even after the deepest heartbreak, the heart remembers how to love differently, but still beautifully. The next morning, the sun rose through the same window where I once cried alone. Now, its light felt different, not because it changed, but because I did. I stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth touch my face. I smiled, softly, and said to myself, I forgive, not for him, but for me. And in that whisper, I felt something inside me finally let go. The last fragment of resentment, the last echo of pain. What remained was peace. Quiet, humble peace. And the realization that maybe, after all, this was what love was meant to be. Not a fairy tale, not perfection, but two people learning to be kind again.